Hello everyone, this is Sharonna Banerjee and I welcome you to another live session by Voyages into the Past, Otit Pravaho. We are extremely fortunate to have with us today Dr. Shibashis Chatterjee, Professor of International Relations and Director of the School of International Relations and Strategic Studies at Jadavpur University in Kolkata. His areas of interest include international relations theory, foreign policy, and South Asian politics. He has authored a number of books like Nuclear Nonproliferation and the Problem of Threshold States from Minerva Publications in 1999 and India's Spatial Imaginations of South Asia from Global Oxford University Press in 2019. He is the co-editor of several volumes, including the one called Peace and Conflict Studies, Perspectives from South Asia. Professor Chatterjee has published extensively in journals like India Review, Japanese Journal of Political Science, Economic and Political Weekly, etc. A recipient of the Fulbright Visiting Fellowship twice, he has taught at Indiana University in 2011 and Yale University in 2016-17. Besides, he has held visiting affiliations to Macquarie University in Uganda, University of Hull in UK, and McGill University in Canada. Today, Professor Shibashis Chatterjee will be talking on the topic International Order, Competing Imagination. Without further delay, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Okay, I hope I'm audible. Right at the outset, let me make a few, I would say, general comments. One is that, look, I don't have any paper, I don't have any notes. I would just sort of, share with you a set of ideas which I think they are significant, they're important, they're interesting. And the second thing is that I'm also aware of the fact that, we possibly have a very diverse set of audience today. Okay, I mean, not everybody who is based in the discipline of international relations or even political science. Okay, I mean, so I'm mindful of that, and as a result, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to peg myself at a level which would be somewhere between an audience which is a general audience and somewhere between an audience which is a little bit more specialized audience. Okay, I mean, so I would be somewhere in between. In other words, I don't take it for granted that, some of the things that I'm going to say, they are conceptually, I would say, accessible to everybody in terms of the readings that you have. But on the other hand, my whole objective today, in fact, is to make some of these ideas as clear and as lucid as possible. Okay, so that is precisely the, I would say, the task that I have set myself, for today. And the second thing that I need to, I think, tell you is this, that look, I've been talking on, this particular topic, or maybe a certain variation on the theme of this particular topic in the last few months. Okay, so, I've broadly sort of talked on the international order already a number of times. So there could be audience today, okay, many of you, in fact, for whom this would basically be some kind of a repetition of sorts, because I would broadly sort of, talk about ideas which I've already talked about in certain other platforms. The third thing that I need to sort of share is that, look, I mean, I have broadly decided to concentrate on, what I would say, put at, as three broad imaginations, let's say, of the international order, and how these, imaginations, in fact, they cohere, how these imaginations, they make sense, what really are the nuts and bolts of the imagination, and why certain imaginations, in fact, they have a greater purchase in terms of certain theoretical underpinnings compared to certain other imaginations, in fact, which tend to get marginalized due to a variety of reasons. So these are broadly the three general comments with which I'm going to begin today and set the ball rolling. So the first point, in fact, which I put across you is that we need to have some idea, let's say, of what this business of order is about. But before we move, before we start on order, before we get into the business of defining order and looking at the various permutations and combinations of order, I think I also need to say a little bit about what exactly I had thought about. Why these, I would say, uh, multiple imaginations, and why do these imaginations matter? Now, I mean, there is this initial, I would say, formulation with which I need to begin. Absolutely, the first point, which is that look, whenever one is trying to make sense of any reality, one is either consciously or unconsciously deploying a conceptual map on it. Now, this conceptual map, in fact, could be, as I said, a conscious deployment, in which case we would broadly say that I'm trying to make a theoretical sense of a particular order or a particular problem. Or it could be also unconscious, in the sense that it could be more like a regular empirical description. But no regular empirical description, in fact, is an analytical void. Okay, it just can't be that it's analytically, I would say, without, let's say, without a set of underpinning. So even the most, regular descriptive setting that you might think of, that in fact is also a form of theorization. Okay, the difference here is that sometimes we theorize consciously, and when we are theorizing consciously, we are deploying certain frames of analysis. Sometimes we don't theorize, or we think we are not theorizing, and therefore we think that we are broadly sort of describing, what could be called events. Okay, but even a description of events, and that is the point that I'm throwing, at you, is not without a theoretical rendition. Okay, I mean, so if one pays attention to it, one would be able to find certain theoretical strands. Okay, one would be able to find certain frames of analysis in them. Now, there is a bit of, I would say, contestation in terms of what? In terms of the very notion of what theories are. Okay, I mean, the contestation, in fact, is such that there is just no way out of it. Okay, I mean, and in other words, what I'm trying to tell you is this: that there's no way in which we would be able to ever uh, cut through this maze. Okay, in other words, find resolution of this contestation one way or the other. The reason for this, in fact, is that theories have many meanings. To some people, theories are causal statements, like one would say that X leads to Y. Every time X, every time Y. So if it is X leads to Y, every time X, every time Y, then we believe in a form of causal theory. Now, it is axiomatic that causal theories, in fact, are very, very difficult to build in any social science. Okay, hard social sciences, soft social sciences, whichever social science you would like to have. Social scientists, in fact, are, I think, they are still mesmerized by this notion of causality, because they want to emulate, okay, they want to copy natural scientists, they want to theorize like them. And natural scientists, in fact, would mostly have some kind of a causal model. But the problem, in fact, is that our material is such that it is very difficult, in fact, to ultimately mold it in terms of certain distinctive, what you call causal structure. In other words, it's very difficult because of the fact that there are so many factors which actually sort of go into the making of social reality and social things. So it's very difficult, like in a experiment, for example, several factors might be involved. And therefore, when you are trying to what? So when you are trying to, let's say, point out what really are these variables, so you have a set of independent variables and you have a set of dependent variables. When you have identified the independent variables, what many scientists, in fact, would like to do is that either in terms of the experiment, use certain independent variables as causal variables and keep the other independent variables aside. It's not therefore saying that these independent variables, in fact, they're meaningless. No, never. They are important, but for the experiment, they are being kept, let's say, outside, which means that you are having certain control devices. So you are controlling for those variables. Now, Statistically also, because in most cases social scientists in fact would not be able to do experiments, although there is new, I would say, tidal wave of experimentation, which in fact has come in a huge way. So it first came in economics. Everything virtually almost invariably comes first in economics. And then it has come in a big way in political science and other disciplines also, which is a kind of a renaissance of experimental methods. But even then, even granting the fact granting the fact that our new experimental methods are far superior, than the experimental methods that we used to have in the past. But all these experimental methods, in fact, they have a certain limitation, and the limitation is that it is very difficult to control the variables, whether you are doing it experimentally or you are doing it statistically. Very difficult to control them effectively. So we would hardly ever know that whether there is that X, which in fact is exclusively responsible for that Y. Very, very difficult to know. And as a result of this, many social scientists, very rightly, in fact, they say that look, social sciences, in fact, should not necessarily be chasing after causes, but rather they should be about meaning. And these two terms, cause, meaning, they're not exactly the same. I hope everybody, in fact, would agree with me that they're not exactly the same. So when you are into the business of causality, you are in a sense trying to build causal statements which are statistical regularities, which broadly sort of says that if a certain pattern regularity holds over a period of time, then you can with a certain degree of confidence say that that pattern regularity is what we call a theoretical proposition or a theoretical statement. But if you say that we are into meaning, meanings are interpretive, meanings are discursive formulations, meanings are broadly, I would say, a kind of narrativization of reality. And when you say that, which means that, if you say that, well, we are into meaning, meanings would be very, very difficult to adjudicate in life. Okay. And it is here that the whole notion of the different frames of imagination, they become so very important to us. If I put it in a slightly crude manner, and when we use crudity, we have to obviously be a little bit careful because, well, crudity might sometimes be necessary for the sake of explanation. But then when you are using a crudity to explain, let's be aware of the fact that in actual terms, in fact, this crudity, in fact, would have to be, I think, handled with care. But nonetheless, I would use the crude. And which is what? Which is that, look, when we are into meaning, we are looking at reality through certain lenses. Okay. And the color of the lens, the texture of the lens, the property of the lens, to a large extent, in fact, would decide what is it that we see. And it is in this sense that this, beautiful phrase, if you ask me, in fact, becomes so very, I think, meaningful, which is one world, many theories. But, well, a bit of a caution there. One world, many theories would broadly mean what? Would broadly mean that ontologically, we are saying that the world, in fact, is one. Okay, which basically means that, in terms of the way in which the world is constituted, it is one. Theories are cognitive devices which in fact would vary because our conceptual maps vary. Okay, so the world is one, but because our conceptual maps in fact are different. So one conceptual map in fact actually sort of describes the world in one way. The other conceptual maps would describe it in a very, very different way. Okay, now that would broadly therefore be a position which says that ontologically the world seems to be one, but epistemologically, which means in terms of the cognitive devices that we have, these in fact could be described, or these could be explained variously. Many philosophers of sciences, in fact, would disagree and say that the disagreement actually cuts much, much deeper. Okay, it's a far more fundamental, I would say, contestation that we encounter here. And there the argument, in fact, is this: that look, it's not necessarily that the world that we describe, in fact, is one. The world is not one. The world is not one because there's no world outside the theoretical structure that we have. Okay, in other words, there's no world outside the cognitive structure that we have. In other words, let us make this very clear. Okay, one position is this, that there is a world out there. It in fact has certain properties, and the task of theory in fact is to tease out those properties. Okay, I mean, so theory therefore in a sense falls on that world. The other position is just the opposite. It says that there is no world outside the theoretical structure. So the world, in fact, is a constructed reality, and that construction, in fact, actually sort of happens, which means that the properties of the world, in the constitutive sense of the world, in the ontological, therefore, sense of the world, is created through the epistemological devices that we use. Okay, in other words, the epistemological position is prior to the ontological position. Okay, and the earlier argument which I was making is just the opposite, which was broadly saying that the ontological presuppositions, in fact, in a certain way, or the ontological being in a certain fundamental sense, is prior to the theorization that we make. Okay, I mean, it's something like this. If you make a sentence, for example, like this, that look at rainfall. Okay, now rainfall we know is an ecological phenomenon. Now, well, before human beings came into being, there was rainfall. Okay, there's no denying the fact that there was rainfall. But would we recognize it as rainfall? Okay, so would we be able to describe it as rainfall? The first position would say that there should not be a problem. Okay, we must recognize rainfall as rainfall, no matter what kind of theory you have. Okay, because it came before the theory. But many others, in fact, would make a slightly different, I would say, argument, or not a slightly different, maybe a fundamentally different argument, say that even this idea of rainfall, what rainfall in fact is about, is essentially the making of a particular theory. And that particular theory, in fact, is happening within my mind. Okay, I mean, so this is essentially, I think, the contestation that we have here. The priority of the ontic against the priority of the episteme. Okay, I mean, so what exactly is I would say, is more important? Okay, I mean, does reality come before my theories, or do my theories make reality? Okay, and there's no escaping it. Okay, I mean, so therefore, let us not stretch this point any farther, because I think I've been able to make my point. And my point is very simple, that your theories, therefore, would in a sense decide how you describe the reality. Okay, and therefore the many conceptions of order that we come across, okay, and these are all conceptions of order, in the global sense of the term, okay, which means the notions of global order or ideas of global ordering. These are, in a sense, they piggybacked on, okay, they're predicated on the conceptual maps that we have. Okay, so you have a certain conceptual map. Now, how do you get that conceptual map? It's a question. It's a fundamental question. Okay, it's a result of a socialization process, but you bring that conceptual map to bear on the reality that interests you. Okay, and if you are a scholar of international politics and you are interested in this question of the global order, then what you are basically trying to do is you are trying to make sense of what this global order is about, or what global ordering is about, through a specific conceptual map, in fact, into which you are, I think, wedded to. Okay, I mean, so it is not that the global order can be understood independent of that theoretical presupposition. You can never do that. So whenever you are looking at a certain global order and you are describing that global order in a particular way, you are invariably describing it in terms of certain formulations which, for some reason or the other, which in fact you have taken to be your formulation, you've come to sort of believe in it. Okay, I mean, so that's something which is absolutely preliminary, and we need to understand it very well. Okay, I mean, which is that one way of putting it is one world, many theories. The other way of putting it would be many worlds, many theories. Okay, so let's have that point absolutely clear, and I hope everybody here would be with me, that we can either say one world, many theories, or we can say that, well, neither is there one world, nor is there one theory. Theories come prior to the nature of the world. Now, let's come to the more concrete aspect now, which is the whole business of the order. Well, I decided that, look, there could be so many different notions of order that one can decide. I mean, one can discuss. But I decided that for the for the paucity of time and also to keep this manageable, let's say, so that I'm able to do justice to the notions that I pick, we will discuss today, and I will talk about three broad imaginations of order. Okay. Now, these are broadly the liberal, because we still live in the liberal world order. The second is the most, I would say, uh, the most powerful critique of the liberal world order, which is the realist. Do realists really have a notion of order, or they're broadly making an argument that, well, the world in fact gets by through either power and security, and there is no notion of order? It's an interesting question, and we will grapple with it a little bit more. And the third, in fact, is essentially a notion of, which is called a critical, let's say, sort of conception of the order. Now, there is no one critical, and there's no one criticality, okay? There's no one critical imagination at all, as we all know very well. There are various different kinds of critical imaginations, let's say, of the global order. We can't do justice to those variations either, okay? I mean, so I will maybe sort of, pick and choose a little bit from here and a little bit from there and sort of say that what is it about. But in terms of, I would say, ethical connotation, these three imaginations, in fact, they are very, very distinctive. And I want you to understand this very clearly. The liberal ethics is essentially a transactional ethics. Okay, I mean, so the liberals are broadly saying that, look, we have certain, what would we call, we have a certain order, and that order, in fact, is created by virtue of our intentionality. Okay, I mean, and this intentionality gets fleshed in very differently by different liberal scholars. But the argument, in fact, is that the order comes into being because we want a particular kind of a shape, in fact, to take place. And this is essentially transactional in nature. Okay, now transactions could either be in terms of the values of the market, transactions could also be in terms of the values of democracy, transactions could also be in terms of perceptions that domestic, I would say, groups have. But the essential argument is that it's a kind of a transactional order. The second is, if you look at the realists, in fact, in some way or the other, they make the idea or they make the argument that the ethic of the order that you have is the ethic of power and the ethic of security. Not only is it an ethic of power and security, and power and security, they obviously do not necessarily mean the same thing, but it is also an ethic of um, continuity through the millennium. Okay, in other words, there is a kind of dehistoricization, which is involved here. I mean, a kind of de-recognition of history in a theoretical sense. Okay, I mean, obviously not in the epochal sense of the term, but in a theoretical sense, in the sense that most realists, in fact, are making the argument that, look, I mean, the quality of the millennial, global order across the millennia, I mean, doesn't necessarily change. Okay, I mean, so there is a kind of sameness to it. Okay, there's a kind of predictability to it. Okay, and that predictability gets explained ultimately either through the notion of power or through the idea of security, which in fact are claimed to be ubiquitous categories by the realists. And then finally, if you are looking at the radicals, the radical, ethic is always an ethic of transformation. Now, the problem with the ethic of transformation is that radicals obviously would not agree on what is it that is worth transforming. Okay, and they would also not agree on the agents and the prioritization of the let's say, the categories of transformation. So who in fact would have the priority of the transformation, who in fact gets to transform, who in fact has that right, or what is it that needs to change, what is it that needs to transform. Okay, I mean, so if you look at classical Marxism, as you know, classical Marxists in fact had a certain rendition, let's say, of the transformative project, which in fact was primed ultimately in the interest of the fundamental radical transformation in the nature of the production, in the nature of the production relations. Okay, and in the way in which production ultimately is planned in life. But if you look more and more into the critical theories and more into the postmoderns and radicals, in fact, who are post-Marxist radicals, they would not entirely abandon or jettison the original Marxian project, but they would increasingly sort of, add more equivocation to it. They would add more agency into it. They would add more categories to it. And as a result, in fact, the entire transformatory project, in fact, they not only become multidimensional, but they also, in a sense, they become what? They also, sort of raises questions which, in fact, creates debates within the radical, I would say, imagination itself. Okay. So I would therefore make the broad argument that these are the three broad imaginations we have, but then these are not happy churches. Okay, I mean, so there are many sort of doctrinal differences, let's say, within them, but there are obviously certain similarities, okay, which would actually sort of enable us to make this broad categorization. So if there was nothing holding them together, then obviously, they would fall apart. So you can't really describe them in any particular way. So therefore, I mean, if you go, let's take them seriatim. So let's take them one by one, okay? And that's essentially what I intend to sort of do. So if you look at the notion of the order, now, at the outset, scholars of global society, scholars of international relations, in fact, I mean, they, they have had, I would say, well, flirtations with the notion of the order. Okay, in other words, not everybody, in fact, had written extensively on the idea of the order. Some have, particularly, I draw attention to the work of Hedley Bull, whose Anarchical Society, in fact, is possibly the most classic literature that you have, the text that you have, that in fact sort of theorizes this whole idea of the order. And although several new work, in fact, because Hedley Bull's classic, in fact, is again a sort of work which which was published in the 70s, and well, a lot of work, in fact, had obviously gone down gone down the line. Okay, so we have a lot of new work which, in a sense, theorizes the notion of the order, but there's no fundamental, I would say, alteration that I see. So it's a paradigmatic work. Okay, it's a central work. And what Bull says is this, he says that, look, the order is anarchy. Okay, but Bull, in fact, gives a twist to the notion of anarchy. And he says that we don't have any one, what could be called one notion of an anarchical society. So there are various kinds of anarchical societies that you have. Like, for example, you can have an anarchical community. Okay, so if you have an anarchical community, now order making in an anarchical community is very interesting. Like, for example, you can have clans and primitive communities, for example, where order is either the function of horizontal solidarity, or order, in fact, could be an uncritical acceptance of hierarchy. So it could be either. Okay, I mean, so it could either be horizontal or it could be vertical. But what is critical is that this order is independent of a formal sovereignty-centric, sovereignty-oriented, sovereignty-centric state structure. Okay, so such societies, in fact, they do not show instances of sovereignty at all. Okay, but then you would obviously have a notion of togetherness, a notion of purpose, a notion of order. Okay, built into them. The second is that you have the anarchical international, what is called system. Okay, and Bull is absolutely, I would say, critical in drawing the distinction between two terms. I think he overdraws the distinction, but that's a separate point altogether. And these two terms are systems and societies. Okay, but look, the prefix is the same. So he says that you have two, if you have a simultaneous ordering of the global society, and this simultaneous ordering, in fact, can be described either as, number one, an international system of states, and number two, it can also be described as a kind of what he calls an international society of states. So the distinction that he's drawing is between system and society, and it's a pivotal, critical distinction. But what does he put in front? He puts the word anarchy. Okay, so he's not saying that system or society, they are different in terms of the nature of the organization of space. No, both are anarchical. Okay, but then they're different. They're different because the purpose of the system and the purpose of society, the modality of the system, the modality of society, they're not exactly the same. So, for example, if you have, okay, an international system, in an international system, order is preserved through the workmanlike, manipulations of the independent units. Okay, and these independent units, when they are sort of creating an order, they create an order not necessarily because they share a sense of common interest, they share a sense of common purpose. Okay, they may have certain common interests, but interest purpose, they're not exactly the same thing. But they certainly do not necessarily have any sense of common purpose. Okay, but when it comes to international society, it's anarchical. But this anarchy is very different in nature. It means what? It means that an international society comes together because states, in fact, are held together by their collective commitment to certain norms, to certain understandings, to certain precepts. So these commonly held norms, precepts, understandings, in fact, they are absolutely pivotal and vital in keeping the world system going together, not as a system of independent states, but as a society, as an anarchical society, a society which is, in a sense, held together by shared commitment to norms, shared commitment to ideas. Okay, so in a sense, therefore, what we have to clearly sort of understand is that, look, order cannot be conceived without a sense of purpose. You cannot have any order unless, in fact, you have a certain notion of purpose. So if you're looking at a domestic, what you call system, or a domestic setup, for example, a domestic system or a domestic, what you call society is definitely an order. But why is it an order? It's an order because it is predicated towards the security of, what could we call security of our life and limbs, okay, which is absolutely fundamental, pivotal. Then the security of the promises that we make, because if there is no security to the promises, then there is no, there is no finality to any transactional value in life. And the final thing is what? The final thing is that, look, it's also about the security of property. So life, property, promises, these are the purposes of the order. And when it comes to what? When it comes to the making of a domestic order. When you look at the international, what you call system, the international system, in fact, is rather unique, because in the international system, there is no common purpose in that sense, other than the fact that the states, they want to survive. So in addition to the domestic purposes, which obviously would also have to survive on their own, the states, in fact, they also seek the survival of what? They also seek the survival of what could be called their own system. Their own system. And the second thing is what? And the second thing, in fact, is they also need to have a kind of, let's say, a security of not only the system of states, but also the security of independent units, which means the territorial continuity of the independent units. So three things come in here. Okay, I just sort of dress them up for your own benefit. The first is that, look, these states, in fact, this international system becomes an order, or is an order, because it is committed to the preservation of the goals of the domestic system. Okay, so you need the security to life, you need the security to property, you need the security of the promises. But in addition, these units, in fact, they also do what? These units, in fact, they interact in such a way that it also becomes possible for the system of states to survive, and that survival itself becomes a common interest. And as a result, in fact, what happens is that these units themselves, they must also survive. So if the units don't survive, then the totality will also not, survive. So it's very simple. So it's a kind of what? It's a kind of a, I would say, a totality of purposes that you now see. Okay, again, the word purpose has to be understood very, I would say, notionally, because in a system of states, Well, a la Bull, the states, in fact, they are not necessarily, sort of motivated by a sense of a higher purpose, but then they're obviously interested in survival, okay, as a motive. But when it comes to the international society cuts deeper, okay. I mean, because it's, I think, held together by what? It's held together by a sense of purpose. It's held together by certain normative commitments. And this is necessary because otherwise we would be consumed in, endless violence, okay. Because the fundamental problem, in fact, is what? The fundamental problem is articulated by Hobbes, which is that you have the problem of order built into a society because there is no because there is no superior authority unless and until there is a superior authority, let's say. So once a superior authority comes into being, then your purposes, in fact, your interests, they find a certain, sense of security. Without authority, that security, in fact, is nowhere. That security, in fact, is missing. But if you're looking at the international system, obviously there is no such authority. And given the fact that there is no such authority, it means what it means, that ultimately there is a problem which is hanging in there. And that problem is what? That problem, in fact, is that things can come apart at any point of time. And wars happen. Violence do actually sort of take place. But Bull and many others, in fact, like Vincent and others, in fact, they make this argument, and I think it's a very, very important argument, empirically also, that look, most states, most of the time, they don't make war against each other. Okay, so human history is more a history of peace and less a history of war. So if you have to explain why this is the case, then the explanation is borne by the fact that we live not only in an international system of states, but we also live in an international society of states, okay, and a certain, shared sense of moral purpose, a certain, shared sense of, I would say, civility, a certain shared sense of rights. These, in fact, they are a kind of, let's say, product of our societal level, living. They're a certain kind of, let's say, result of our commitment to live in society and not only in systems. We can also have a, theoretically, we can also have a global system or a world society where all these purposes, in fact, would be ultimately at the highest possible level for every individual, for the mankind as a whole. But then it's a kind of a possibility, okay, and it's never been realized in human history thus far, or at least this is what the argument of Bull and others, in fact, they're about. Now, quickly, if you look at the liberals, let's say, just sort of now talk directly, about the liberals. Now, the first is that, look, history is significant and history is important here. History is important in two senses, okay, or maybe in more than two senses. The first is this, that look, every concept, in fact, ultimately develops out of a certain context. So you can't really have concepts, in fact, which would have a life of their own if you cut them away, if you remove them from the context in which these concepts, in fact, they have originally come about. So we have to pay attention to the making of these ideas and the making of the concepts. And it is in this sense, I would say, that the first moment of international relations as a discipline, as we all know, in fact, is a liberal internationalist moment, okay? In the disciplinary sense of the term, okay? Not necessarily in the historical sense of the term, but in the disciplinary sense of the term, the first moment of international relations is definitely a liberal internationalist moment. Now, the liberal internationalists, in fact, they had a very interesting project, if you ask me, which is what? Which is that their basic argument, in fact, is this, that on the one hand, they were celebrating the very fact of Europe. They were celebrating the very fact of Europe in terms of, a very triumphant sort of belief in rationality, in enlightenment, and all that comes out of rationality and enlightenment as a paradigm. But on the other hand, there is a sense of deep pathos and a sense of deep tragedy, because this rationality, this science, this technology, capitalism and everything, it unfortunately doesn't rid societies of the endemic problem of violence. So whether the violence, in fact, is between, states, or the violence is within states, it seems that the European states, in fact, have been almost throughout their history, they had been mired in violence, okay, I mean, bathed by violence. So how is it that this violence, in fact, could be extirpated, okay? How is it that they could get rid of the violence? So that's the fundamental question of the discipline, let's say. And as a result, you find that the first moment historically sort of comes up. Now, there are revisionist historians, obviously, who say that this is not necessarily a genuine reading of the way in which the discipline came about. But if we have to talk about the history and the historicity, then we have to have some other day, okay, where I might talk about the historicity of the discipline. But the fact is that at this point of time, what is critical is that the conventional account, in fact, broadly says that the liberal internationalists, in fact, they very clearly came up with two fundamental arguments. And these two fundamental arguments, in fact, are the following. The first fundamental argument, in fact, is a domestic pathology argument, as we all know, which basically says that, look, the problem seems to be that, while the European states, in fact, were getting developed, but their political development, in fact, was lacking. In other words, their politics was still very much a politics of the aristocratic atavistic societies. And because of these various kinds of atavisms, what was happening was that there was no democratic transition which actually was taking place. And given this lack of democratic transformation in the project, well, many of these what could be called these consequences of enlightenment, okay, the positive consequences of enlightenment, many of these, in fact, they could not actually be realized in these societies. In other words, what was happening is that Europe, in fact, was very much authoritarian space, okay? And authoritarianism basically meant what it meant, that it is a form of unaccountable political power. So if it is if it is a form of unaccountable form of political power, then the rulers, in fact, were fundamentally interested in regime legitimation. So they wanted to somehow, you know, uh, continue their rule. They never really wanted to give up on their, on their control of the system. And as a result, in fact, their extractive devices, in fact, were extremely what could be called harsh in nature. Now, in this game, wars came very handy because wars were popular diversionary tactics. Okay, so you could fight a short war, and if you win the war, then it invariably it gives you a lot of prestige, and that prestige becomes a compensatory strategy. Okay, so what you were missing in terms of domestic legitimation, you are in a sense compensating it by your foreign policy success. Now, this foreign policy success is war success. Okay, so you need to get into more and more violence. The second argument which the liberal internationalists, in fact, were giving, in fact, was this: that, look, the idea of peace, which the European statesmen had arrived at, was essentially built on the equivocations of balance of power. Okay, so they believed that if you had an effective, a good balance of power, then ultimately the system, in fact, will remain in shape. Okay, there will be peace. But as the theory of balance of power, in fact, shows, that one, that it's a very problematic theory, and the second is that its history, in fact, is so convoluted because you actually need to fight a lot of war, in the interest of a balance which you think is the right kind of balance. Okay, so there is no separation, therefore, between the politics of balance on one hand and the politics of war and peace on the other. Okay, and given the fact that there is this intermeshing and intertwining, what was happening was that in the interest of balance, states were actually ending up fighting more. Okay, so there was no necessary correlation between balance and peace. The other correlation seemed to be working more powerfully, which is, well, balance often got caught in this, continuous cycle of what, interstate violence. Now, there's no obviously, there's no easy solution to this problem, but the liberal internationalists, they did come up with a problem, what you call solution. Unfortunately, as history would have it, that both their solutions, in fact, proved to be wrong solutions, okay, fallacious solutions, at least in the mid run or in the short run. These arguments, in fact, they did not really come true. So, democratization, in fact, didn't actually lead to peace, okay, contra Kant, the Republican peace thesis. It actually didn't happen by virtue of the fact that, look, in Europe, if you're looking at the interwar period, fascism was, in a sense, almost invariably a post-democratic political order, because fascism, in fact, is a fiercely mobilization-based system. Okay, so you never confuse fascism with a conventional, traditional military dictatorship. A military dictator did not mobilize the mass, but a fascist would have to fiercely mobilize the masses. So whether you were looking at a Mussolini or you're looking at Hitler, all these leaders, in fact, they came into power through democratic means. Okay, and then the history, in fact, is well known. So what resulted out of that? So there's no guarantee that there is this very easy, I would say, unproblematic correlation between a democratic transformation on one hand and a peaceful global order on the other. So the first leg, in fact, I think was destroyed by history itself. The second was even more cataclysmic because of the fact that if balance of power is a problem, then collective security is the solution. And we all know the history of the early collective security experimentation, which is um, the unprecedented, I would say, failure of the League. And E.H. Carr's critique, in fact, becomes so very canonical in this context, because what Carr shows is this, that his broad argument is that, look, something like the League could never have succeeded because the League never reflected the true balance of forces in global politics. And in politics, you can never have universal standards of morality, universal standards of justice, because these are functions of the dominant power. So once you made those kinds of claims, okay, you say that those who sort of dominate, their perspective, in fact, becomes the morality of the day. Their rules, in fact, become international norms. Their, standards become the norms of the international order. Then obviously the revisionists, in fact, they're just waiting for the right kind of opportunity. Okay, and when the power balance tips, when it becomes unsustainable, as it happens, as we move towards the when we start towards towards the tempest of the Second World War. So what happens actually is that it sort of virtually explodes onto the face. Okay, and the system is almost sort of I would say rip apart. And what destroys the system, according to this argument, is the very unviability of a system which is built on this notion that you can have this grandiose, what you call shared moral argument, or a grandiose shared, what would we call uh, shared moral standards of morality, justice, international law. So these, in fact, are rubbished. And accordingly, we have law. We have a severe sort of critique coming up in the discipline. But this but is important, and I wanted to underline the but. After Second World War, the order which gradually took shape, and that order which still on wobbly legs, okay, it's sort of almost given in, but it's still, sort of in a way continuing, is very much a liberal, international order. It's still a liberal international order. And that is again because of the way in which history, in fact, had decided the course of events. The Second World War is won by by the Allied powers, and the United States emerges as the most dominant power of the world. And the dominance of the United States, in fact, meant that for the first time in the history of the rise and fall of great powers, what we find is, and this is important, is that the baton, in fact, is passed on peacefully. So there is no system shaping huge war actually taking place between Britain on one hand and the United States on the other. No, they are on the same side. Okay, so the British, in fact, they pass on the baton, okay, to the United States. And so there is a certain continuity in the imagination also, which therefore happens. So they believe in democracy, they believe in rule of law, they believe in liberal, open, free trading economic systems. So these, in fact, they remain what? They remain I would say, the motors of the international order and the new international order, in fact, that gets shaped. And here, and this is an argument which I've been sharing, okay, repeatedly with students, okay, and with the audience again and again, because it's so very important, is that, look, if you look closely, at the writings of Eikenberry, Kupcha, Dewdney, and others, for example, I mean, they make this so very clear, particularly Eikenberry, that, look, the order which took shape in the post-1945 period in fact succeeded because of the fact that between 1945 and 1991, this order was not a genuinely global order. This was not a genuinely global order because the world was divided into ideologically into two camps. Okay, so you had the United States, and leading the Western camp, the capitalist world, the liberal democratic capitalist world, and you had the Soviet Union, which in fact was which was leading, what was known as the socialist world. Now, not only were these two configurations different, but something which is very, very important is to understand that the dynamic density of the Cold War period was limited, which means that the interactions within the system as a whole prior to 1991, in fact, was limited. Okay, so if you're looking at the total volume of trade, you're looking at the total volume of transactions, you're looking at the total volume of institutionalization, all these, in fact, were much limited in number, okay, in amount. So as a result, the international order, which in fact one finds between 45 and let's say 1991, and one can obviously make fine categorizations there. Now that international order, in fact, is in many ways was an US-led international order, which had two other components to it: the West European states and Japan. So it was a coherent order. Okay, I mean, so there was agreement on the leadership and the legitimacy of the leadership. There was a broad agreement on the security binding. There was a sense of security community there. And most importantly, you see, what is critically important is that this particular system did not suffer from what is called the problem of overweight, the problem of overextension. So as a result, there was a kind of coherence in this relative parochiality. There was a sense of coherence, let's say, in this international liberal order. And that coherence was largely responsible for the success that the liberal international order experienced during this period. Now, 1991, as we know, the Cold War system comes to an end. We are into the post-Cold War era. And this moment of triumph paradoxically also becomes the moment the moment of the chink in the armor, the moment of weakness. And this moment of weakness actually happens because of two factors. The first is that, look, this is the time when the liberal order, through the making of the WTO and the further proliferation of institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, is genuinely becoming a global order for the first time. So its membership, in fact, experiences an exponential increase. And as different kinds of states, in fact, they come into the system, what happens is that the earlier continuity and coherence, in fact, they are lost. Okay, so now there is the questioning of leadership. Now there is the questioning on cost sharing. Now there is the questioning of the legitimacy of the order, kinds of questions which you did not encounter in the previous time, in the previous year. The second, I think, is a very interesting point, which is that, look, the relative success that you witnessed, which sort of created what Rage, in fact, had described as embedded liberalism. Now that fulcrum of the embedded liberal order, in fact, was a social contract. Now this social contract, in fact, had two faces to it. One, in fact, is a geopolitical phase, which is essentially manifested in the notion of security community, which basically says that, look, you make a community where there is a transformation in the nature of relationship that historically, adversarial states, in fact, had enjoyed with each other. Now, the paradigmatic case, in fact, is the relationship between France and Germany. Okay, the hereditary enmity, let's say. This was completely transformed. So if you're looking at the model of European multilateral order, which in fact is the crux of the system, now that multilateral order, in fact, is essentially built on the unprecedented kind of peace that one finds, the making of the security community between France on one and Germany on the other. Okay, so that's basically one phase of the order. But there is a deeper phase to the order, which is social contract, which is called a social, compact, between labor on one hand and capital on the other. Now, this is essentially an argument which says that, look, if you are looking at this particular period of capitalism, this period of capitalism, in fact, is broadly what could be called a period of welfare capitalism. Okay, very broad. In other words, this is not a period of rentier capitalism. Okay. Now, in other words, what you find is that this is a period where there is dual commitment that one comes across. The first is that the capitalist societies are obviously committed to the principle of accumulation. Okay, so you need to accumulate, capital, because if you don't accumulate capital, you're not making enough profit. If you don't make profit, then the viability of the system, in fact, will beyond the point collapse. Okay, so it becomes very difficult in that way. The second commitment, in fact, is a commitment to a completely different principle altogether, which is the principle of legitimation. Okay, in other words, not only do you need to have a commitment to the notion of capitalism, but you also need to have a commitment to a notion of democratic legitimation. Okay, now the way in which this was balanced, in fact, is by transforming what? Is by transforming the nature, let's say, of the whole business of I would say the whole business of the capitalist system. To some extent, there's a fundamental transformation, obviously, but capitalism, in fact, increasingly sort of has a more human face to it. It's more welfare. Okay, now one would have to understand that, look, there is a built-in tension into this kind of a dual commitment. Okay, your commitment to accumulation means that beyond a point you can't tax profit, because if profit plummets, then there's bound to be deep crisis, let's say, for the very survival of the system in political economic terms. But on the other hand, your commitment to democratic legitimation means that you must have sufficient monetary commitment to welfare. Okay, now welfare therefore demands money, and money comes from taxes. Okay, so what is the point at which the a point which is, I would say, low enough for the first coincided with a point which would be high enough for the second, was always very, very difficult to, I think, very, very difficult to achieve in the real system. In other words, there was this inbuilt cogitation in the system. But no matter what the cogitation was, there was a broad conscience that this social compact between labor on one hand and capital on the other, in fact, needed to hold. Okay, now post 1991, that completely, is destroyed. So you no longer have welfare capitalism in the post 1991 period for a considerable length of time, but rather, in fact, you have globalization setting in, and with globalization, the rentier, capitalism, the more neoliberal variety of capitalism, in fact, with all its, I would say, neoliberal governmentality, in fact, they get, in a sense, they begin to what? They begin to challenge, they begin to eat into the vitals, the sinews of the earlier consciences. So, to wrap this section up, what I'm broadly sort of telling you is this, that on the one hand, the earlier system, in fact, was succeeding because it was coherent, and it was also succeeding because, it had turned itself into a social compact and into a security community. But now, in the post-1991 period, in fact, you find what? You have a completely different set of challenges coming up. The coherence is lost. The social compact, in fact, is destroyed. And the security community also, increasingly comes under strain because of the, almost sort of empire-like, I would say, pressure that comes from the United States. But even more so, given the fact, or because of the fact, that the liberal order had provided the opportunity for non-liberal states to become powerful by playing through the norms and by playing through the principles of liberalism as a whole. Okay, so the rise of China, the spectacular rise of China, one would have to understand, in fact, happens because the Chinese, they didn't jettison the order. Okay, they grew their strength. They became powerful through the system, not like the Soviet Union during the Cold War era, where they had sort of broadly remained outside the system, which was also largely responsible, for the fact that they ultimately imploded because of the fact that they were not economically productive enough. But the Chinese, in fact, they had a completely different orientation to themselves. So they integrated with within the liberal order. And once they integrated into the liberal order, this integration was a functional integration. Okay, it wasn't a normative integration at all. It's not that they were validating the liberal order in terms of ideas, okay, in terms of goals, but they were just taking advantage of it in functional terms. And once they became powerful, now they began to challenge the fundamental ideas which in fact held together this liberal system of the liberal order. This is also partly true, with Russia. The difference being that in case of Russia, because of the fact that Russians, obviously, they are not in any way economically as powerful as the Chinese. So they began to flex muscles in their own, what could be called, theater of influence, which had historically been their own sphere of influence. So the Russians, in fact, they become more and more vocal. They become more and more, I would say, risk-taking. And as the Russians, in fact, become more and more vocal, risk-taking, and engages in military, what you call operations, both overt and covert. Now, that has a ripple effect, okay, on the nature of the security community, which in fact was at a certain point of time in the post-1945 period, promising to transform the continent of Europe into a completely different kind of a space, okay, a very different kind of a security community. So that doesn't seem to be happening any longer. Now, quickly, I think, I've already spoken for an hour, okay? But then very quickly, if you look at the realists, see, the realist imagination, very, very, I would say in a very basic sense, as I said, is not an imagination of order, okay, in the conventional sense of the term. Because what the realists broadly what the realists broadly say is that, look, nations ultimately, they run the international system because the international system, in fact, is predicated on a constellation of forces arising out of specific geopolitical commitment to national interests. In simplest of terms, what I want to tell you is this, that look, the realists are broadly making the argument that states are basically ontologically primitive. So their ontology begins and ends with nation states. And once you have that kind of a primitive ontology, which begins and ends with nation states, all that you have to do, in fact, is that you have to make the explanation that for some reason or the other, the states, in fact, would only be interested in realizing their own national interests. Realists are not interested in the domestic, characters of the state. They're not interested in what kind of a state you are. You get the point, like that proverb: the cat is a cat is a cat. So the state is a state is a state. Okay, so they're not interested in looking at the domestic, what you call differences of the state. The broad argument, in fact, is that the state will survive, and the state can only survive because the state, in fact, is a unifunctional kind of what you call unit. Its sole function, in fact, is to provide security, okay, to the population within, and also to provide security against the threat that comes from similar units from outside. The classical realists, who are in fact human nature realists, they found this motivation in human nature itself. Okay, I don't need to elaborate this. The argument, in fact, is this: that look, there's an animus dominandi in man. So we have a natural tendency to err. Okay, so we are essentially morally, well, a compromise. So we have a tendency, in fact, to, to decline morally. Okay, so we get things wrong. Individuals in their private life, can plan their life according to religious codes. Okay, which means that they can, by and large, they can take care of their sense of moral guilt. Okay, by praying under the charge. Okay, or some charge. Okay, charge doesn't necessarily mean it has to be Christian charge. Religion, let's say, comes to the rescue of the soul of the individual. But there is no charge for the state. Okay, so the classical distinction here is between public morality on one hand and private morality on the other. So when it comes to public morality, it's all about prudence and success. Okay, so you don't judge by what is called the standards of private morality. Okay, like for example, that you need to do good. Okay, you need to keep your promises. You should not kill anybody. Okay, you should be a good man. Now that goodness, this whole notion of goodness, in fact, has absolutely no credibility when it comes to public life. Now, subsequently, realists realized that this was a weak theory, because there's no way that you can actually say that whether human beings in fact are motivated by an ineradicable animus dominandi, or there is, a more powerful cooperative strands in human beings. So whether we are friendly, whether we are rivalrous, whether we have a natural tendency to make enemies and friends, there's no way that any social scientific theory would ever be able to sort of find out. So the realists understood that, look, their worldview was very attractive by virtue of the fact that most statesmen, in fact, they have, in a sense, been wedded into it. But it was not academically attractive enough, particularly given the fact that, from the 60s onwards, there was this very high, I would say, attraction, let's say, for the positivistic social science, making, or the making of, I would say, the making of scientific social sciences. As a result, what happened? As a result, the language of realism sort of entirely changes. Okay, so the ethic never changes. The, in a sense, the commitment of the realists never change, but the explanation changes. So now the realists, in fact, are broadly making an argument which is something like this. They say that, look at markets. Just as an example, look at the market. Now, the market weeds out efficiency, but not necessarily because the firms, in fact, they have any special commitment to efficiency. The dynamic is such that if they're not efficient, they realize they will not survive. Okay, so efficiency, in fact, becomes, in a sense, the expedient, argument. I mean, in other words, it's not a normative argument. They don't want to be efficient, and that is why they become efficient. They must become efficient, otherwise they will not be there. Okay, now this is a kind of an argument which now comes in political realism, and the argument gets shaped in the language of kind of a structuration theory, where the argument is that, look, you would not be able to understand why political realism is powerful by looking simply at the states, or looking simply at foreign policy. So realists don't need to bother so much about foreign policy. They must ultimately bother about the big, what you call the big picture. Okay, the big pattern. And that big pattern, in fact, is to be found in the very anarchical nature of the international system. Okay, which basically sort of means the absence of a central regulatory authority. And that absence of the central regulatory authority means that, unlike in domestic systems where authority is organized in the line of authority, in the international system, well, power in fact is decentralized. Okay, so the argument is that the balance of power is not a foreign policy formulation. The balance is automatic to the system itself, because no state can actually allow any other state, in fact, to become so powerful that they become hegemony. Okay, so that they're able to what? So that they're able to control the life. They're able to dictate terms to the other states. Okay, because if you allow that, then you are at the mercy of this hegemonic form, what you call state. And when you are at the mercy of the hegemonic state, well, whether you survive or not, it depends on the goodwill of the hegemon. So no state, in fact, will actually take that risk, not because states, in fact, are moral, not because states are immoral, but because states have no option. Okay, that's the logic of the system. My point is what? My point is that, look, realists, therefore, they do not give us any calibrated notion of the order. Okay, their simple point is that if you talk of an order, the order is essentially the order of balance. There is a kind of a balance. Now, the balance could either be because there is a kind of fulcrum, balance, which means on both sides is equal weight, or it could be because of the effects of a hegemonic system. Okay, realists are divided on that. But the argument that the realists are broadly making is that there is no multilateralism, there is no independent effects of institutions. All these, in fact, they carry the reflections of the superior powers. Okay, all these, in fact, are the functions of superior power. Okay, in other words, it's the understanding that one needs to have is how the international system, because of the anarchy as a principle of organization, how the international system actually creates balance of power as the only possible order. Okay, most realists, in fact, would believe in this. Some realists disagree. They say that no, balance of power is never an order. But if you have periods of order, these are only periods of hegemony. I repeat, realists are divided on this. So if you have somebody like Robert Gilpin, okay, or if you have a historian, okay, like for example Gilpin, in many senses Gilpin's work, or Dehio, whose work is more historical, they are broadly sort of making an argument, which is, Dehio says that you have balance, Gilpin says you have hegemony. Okay, or if you read that classic book, Rise and Fall of Great Powers, now that is a book which also talks about rise and fall of hegemonic powers. Okay, so in every epoch, in every period, there was this great hegemonic power which in fact had essentially set the ball rolling, which in fact had created the norms of the system. Creating the norms of the system basically sort of meaning that they create the structure within which international life unfolds. So fundamentally, you either have a balance of power system or you have a hegemonic system. But it's not really order making, either in the multilateralist sense of the term, which in fact would autonomize institutions, or in the normative sense of the term, which in fact would emphasize on factors like normativity, identity, etc. And finally, let me talk a little bit on the radical. The radical imagination, in a sense, in international politics, when it comes to global, I would say, imagining. The radical imagination, the most, I would say, attractive radical imagination are two. The first of these, in fact, is an imagination which came from the work of a critical theorist called Robert Cox. Now, Robert Cox, essentially what he does is that he brings Antonio Gramsci's work into international relations, and he broadly makes the argument which Gramsci was making for very broadly Gramsci in fact was making for domestic politics again. And if you pay attention to the argument that Gramsci in fact was making, Gramsci was essentially saying that look, capitalism advanced Western societies, capitalism doesn't rule by force or coercion. Capitalism rules by hegemony, which is a form of consensual domination, which becomes a collective common sense of the people. Now, it becomes the collective common sense of the people because the capitalists, in fact, they have been able to create this idea about the inevitability or the infallibility of the capitalist order. And Gramsci was broadly making the argument that unless there is a counter hegemony, there is no way that this capitalist hegemony in fact would come apart. And those who are familiar with Gramsci's work would also recall that Gramsci says that in a period, in a society where you have hegemony, which is consensual domination, then you need what? And you need a protracted war of position, and not a war of maneuver, okay, which is a revolutionary seizure of power. Because, well, guns can fight against guns, but if you have to fight against ideas, then you obviously need to create alternative ideas. So if you fail to create alternative ideas which would motivate subjectivity, you're not going to win this fight ultimately through guns. Okay, there is considerable debate amongst Gramsci scholars, in terms of whether Gramsci was jettisoning, let's say, the revolutionary transformation towards a kind of a perennial passive revolution idea or not. But the fact is what? The fact is that, most Gramsci scholars, in fact, would tend to argue that Gramsci's basic argument is that the war of maneuver, in fact, is a tactical moment in a much more extended war of position. In other words, Gramsci, in fact, is neither saying that the revolutionary transformation, in fact, is impossible and unnecessary, nor is he saying that it is an inescapable. and a sufficient and necessary condition, let's say, for the transfer of power. So there is this built-in ambiguity in Gramsci's system. What Robert Cox does is that Cox takes this idea into the global system, and he broadly says that, look, the global order is a hegemonic order, and this hegemony must be understood not in terms of any coercive, what could be called articulation through military policies as we conventionally understand it, but this hegemony must be understood ideologically, ideationally. Okay, in other words, there is this creation of a certain global, what could be called ideological, historic bloc, and that global historic bloc, in fact, is created in a sense, it is created through the deliberations of great powers, but it's also a kind of a vertical, determination, because it is ultimately the hegemon which in fact would decide the characters of that hegemonic order. And Gramsci was broadly sort of also making the argument that, look, three periods of hegemony, or three periods of the global hegemonic order, so that from the post-Napoleonic to the period just before the 20th century, begins. Now that's the liberal order, roughly up till about 1875. Then from 1875 to about 1945, you have the imperial order, which sort of witnesses, the not only the combustible transformation in the nature of capitalism, but also the imperial wars. And then you have the neoliberal order, a la, Cox, which comes into being from 1945 onwards. But then Gramsci sort of divides it into phases. He says that from 71, 72, that in fact was the classical period, and then contestation begins from 72 onwards. And then from 1991 onwards, we are into globalization. And Gramsci, in fact, is also a interesting, theorist of globalization in terms of the global order, I would say, imagination. I'm sorry, Cox. Cox is an interesting, I would say, theorist of globalization in terms of a global order imagination. Because what Cox does is that he says that, look, globalization is not only uh, a neoliberal formulation, which it is, but globalization is also a transformation in the nature of the hegemony, which means that the earlier hegemony of capital changes its nature when it comes into the phase of globalization. Okay, and it obviously it becomes what? It becomes far more stratified, it becomes nuanced, and it also becomes far more complex. So that fighting globalization also, in fact, will require very different kind of counter hegemonic strategies. Okay, and like ideas like the rainbow coalition, for example, so that labor in fact must find you know uh, partners. Okay, labor must find coalition partners in terms of whether what would be called racial inequalities, people who are fighting against racial inequalities, gender inequalities, uh, and people with alternative and radically different sexual orientation. So all of these, in fact, they come together into a rainbow coalition. Now, the rainbow coalition is a kind of a counter-hegemonic moment, but Cox never really builds this up sufficiently, because he sort of recognizes the fact that it's very difficult to sort of put together, because what is it that is going to ultimately hold this rainbow coalition as a kind of a coherent strategy against the narrative of globalization? Okay, now we are into times where possibly another transformation, in fact, is taking place, which is again, in a sense, I would say, instigated by the transformation in the materiality of life. But it is not limited only to the materiality of life, and therefore you need to capture it in the ideational scape as well. So it is also a transformation in the ideas, and that transformation is directly related to the perils of globalization. Okay, and these perils of globalization, in fact, they do not necessarily, I mean, sort of refer to the conventional shortcomings of globalization that we know about. Okay, like for example, it has created a lot of class divide, okay, between the north and the south. It's sort of mortgage the security of the planet to rentier corporate interests. So these are critiques that we're familiar with. But what we are witnessing now is a different kind of a shift to the critique, which actually, uh, I think, shifts the focus from the external effects of globalization to the more insidious internal impacts of globalization, okay, which means that the focus is now on countries which in fact were in the forefront of globalization. So whether you were looking at the United States or you were looking at West Europe, so these are the two fundamental, I mean, sort of, let's say, citadels of power that you are focusing on. The focus, in fact, is to look inward and not outward. Okay. And the transformation is this twofold. One is that there is a realization that the working class in these societies, which in fact had benefited earlier from the welfare protective, welfare state, in fact have actually been orphaned by this globalization. And this orphaning sort of means what? Means that, they were broadly sort of told that, look, the only way that they could actually do good under globalization was by investing in skills and being successful by playing globalization according to the norms of globalization. Which means what? Which means is very typical materialistic capitalist understanding of success, material success. But there is a realization that material success, in fact, is only one, what you call form of success in life. And not everybody, well, would not encounter material success. So there is a natural material orphan. But there is the other argument, which is that those who have succeeded by playing the game of globalization, the so-called elite, they have completely snapped their bonds with the working class and those who could not gain material success by playing according to the rules and according to the norms of globalization. In other words, there is this orphaning of honor and dignity and the what could be called the implosion of solidarity, that in fact is responsible for the rise of a phenomena like Trump or the authoritarian right-wing populism that you see not only in the United States but also in many West European, Central European and East European countries. Because the problem seems to be that what globalization in fact did was that it emptied these societies from within. Okay, I mean, it sort of created a narrative which in fact was only a one-dimensional kind of a narrative. But our lives are not one-dimensional. Okay, I mean, so if we are, well, if we are motivated by the considerations of profit and money, but we also have thymotic stirrings about ourselves, honor also matters. Okay, so isothymia and and megalomania, both of these in fact, these are what, these are historically had been critical factors in human civilization and human life. So we need to pay attention to the claims of honor, claims of, I would say, dignity, claims of solidarity. Okay, and globalization in fact had completely blown away these concerns. Okay, and emptied these societies from within. And the second, and this is the last point that I share with you, because this is where the critical imagination in fact needs to, I think, ultimately farm up, is that, look, one of the problems with globalization in fact was that globalization was also in a sense talking about an ideological hegemony, mm, and homogenization, which in fact is possibly, well, in a sense epitomized by the puerile philosophy of Francis Fukuyama, who talked about the end of history. But the idea in fact is that ultimately sort of liberalism triumphs, and this liberalism in fact becomes a kind of universalistic liberalism. Okay, and this universalistic liberalism means what? Means that it ideologically falls like a hood not only across the world, but it also in a sense becomes insensitive to the older ideological contestations and the traditional ideological, I would say, uh, positioning that one came across in most Western societies. In simplest of terms, what does it mean? It means that look, there is this inbuilt tension in liberalism. Is liberalism ultimately about creating a universal hegemonic culture where everybody, in fact, would be liberal in the sense of prioritizing ideas like liberty, ideas like individuality, ideas like material success? Or liberalism must also be, or liberalism rather, all is all is also simultaneously a theory of diversity and particularity. So this tension about the universalization of liberalism or the generalizability of liberalism as a project on one hand, and the value plurality and the sensitivity to particularity, which is also born out of the liberal commitment on the other, in fact, is a fundamental tussle which globalization wanted to settle once and for all in favor of the former, which means creating a hegemonic version of liberalism, where liberalism, in fact, would basically sort of become a teleological summation, let's say, of human society. But that actually comes at a huge cost, okay, and it resulted in a deep, deep crisis within liberalism. Because the essential problem with liberalism, there are many problems with liberalism, okay, I mean, let's not get into that. But the essential problem with liberalism, in fact, is that how is it that liberals, in fact, would be able to hold on to their fundamental value commitments on one hand, and on the other hand, also recognize the inevitability of difference on the other. So, how is it that you are able to reconcile these two ideas? Okay, so how is it that you are able to, on the one hand, agree to the fact that liberalism, in fact, is about the celebration of certain values as homogeneous, okay, as universal, but simultaneously, it is also a doctrine of differences. You get the point, So, in other words, how would liberalism farm up against the possibility, the irreducible possibility of the fact that any liberalism must take shape in societies where many people are fundamentally illiberal? So how would liberalism, in fact, live up to this challenge? One way that liberalism could live up to this challenge, in fact, is by limiting itself as what? As a political doctrine. So you say what you say, that liberalism, in fact, is not about the battles of the soul. It is only about organizing our political life so that we are able to share our, I would say, uh, a certain, we are able to share a uh, certain commitment to a certain set of values. But we are never going to settle the deep dissonances of our life, the deep ideological commitments that we have. Okay, so liberalism, in fact, is not going to talk of religion. Liberalism, in fact, is going to, in a sense, privatize the question of religion, because there's no way, because religion, in fact, is essentially, a comprehensive philosophy. It's a comprehensive notion of the good that liberals, in fact, will be able to ultimately come up with what? Come up with a solution which, in fact, is going to be satisfactory to everybody. Hmm? So, therefore, the liberalism which becomes acceptable is either a procedural liberalism, which would only be a limited liberalism that would talk of toleration, okay, tolerating the differences that you have. Or it could be what? Or it could be a multiculturalist liberalism, okay, which would broadly be a liberalism of value plurality. So either you say that you can have a liberal project by jettisoning the commitment to the universalizing trust, or you say that liberalism, in fact, is never about universalization at all, but it is about the inevitable value pluralities of life. So, whichever way you look at it, the fundamental point is this, that globalization, in fact, had actually pushed liberalism towards a more universalizing tendency, towards a discursive universalizing discourse. And that, in fact, had not only created problems in non liberal societies outside Europe, where the problem, in fact, had been about the perils of westernization, but it had also created enormous problems in Western societies, because the Western societies had never really agreed on the meaning of liberalism in the first time, in the first, what you call, in the first place. So a radical project which wants to redefine, I think, the global order would have to somehow or the other grapple with these challenges. Okay, in other words, if you are looking at the transformatory projects, the transformation, in fact, would have to somehow grapple with these problems. Okay, it cannot bypass these problems. If it wants to bypass these problems, then this transformation, in fact, would not really be a meaningful transformation. So this is where I think I would leave it. Okay, and I would be very happy taking your questions. I'm sorry, I think I spoke much longer than I intended to, but as it is always the case, I end up speaking much more than I should be. Thank you so much.
Okay, so that was a very enriching talk by Professor Shibashis Chatterjee. Now, sir, shall we move on to the questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, okay. So the first one is from Orithro Roy Bormon. He's saying that he is not a student of IR, but he finds your lecture quite intriguing. Given the current circumstances, since you mentioned about fascism at one occasion, my question is, we can see a kind of rightward resurgence worldwide. What is your opinion on the shape of global international order, say in the next 10 years? Will the increasing rightward shift of political opinion in a larger scale affect the international order?
Okay, I mean, this is a rather long question to answer. Okay, but I'll broadly say that, look, I mean, I would not be able to predict. Okay, I mean, this business of prediction is very, very difficult. Okay, and so I would not be able to predict. But broadly, if you go by the trend, one would have to, I think, ask the question, why the right wing authoritarian, variety or the variants of politics, they are on the rise. So unless you understood why they're, in a sense, why they're, I would say, on the rise, why they're becoming more acceptable, let's say, you would not be able to, go to the next, I would say, question, which is, how is it that you end this particular tendency? Okay, what is the solution to the problem? So any problem, the first is what? The first is, you have to understand, okay, I mean, where does the problem come from? So why is it that the right wing, in fact, is resurgent? Okay. And unless you understood that part, how is it that you're going to strategize against it? Okay. I mean, how is it that you're going to find a solution to the problem? That's my point. Now, there is no easy answer to the first part of the formulation that I offered as an answer. Why is it that the right wing, in fact, is gung ho? Why is it that right wing, in fact, is coming up? Not easy answers, okay? But I think I've tried my best in order to give you a sense of why this is happening. Because if you look at the conventional narratives of the alternative politics, okay, the liberal politics in particular, now that conventional narrative, in fact, had not paid sufficient attention to many of the problems, okay, that it actually needed to pay attention to. It had either sidestepped them, or it had tried to what, or it had tried to avoid these questions, or it had been utterly insensitive, let's say, okay, to a whole set of queries. Okay, I'll just give you some examples. One that we are very well aware of, one which we are very well aware of, which is what, which is that the form of liberalism which in fact had been dominant in the last 20 years, let's say, okay, many of you in fact are 20-year people, okay, and so Many of you, in fact, I mean, if you look at the time that you have been born and you've sort of grown up, so if you look at the capitalism of this particular time, in fact, has witnessed what is called, again, momentous, I would say, crisis in the history of global capitalism. But at the same time, while this is a time of crisis, you don't find any meaningful alternative emerging. Okay, I mean, so you don't find that there are alternative ways of producing wealth, distributing wealth. So the conventional alternative, in fact, is no longer, for a long time. The conventional alternative, in fact, is not really applicable. Let's say, at least it's not applicable at this point of time. So the important argument is what? The important argument is that, look, capitalism of the kind which in fact had been active in the last 20 years, it had led to what? It had led to huge, what you call desertions. Okay, I mean, so many people in fact have lost their jobs. Many people in fact have not only lost their jobs, I mean, they've become footloose. Okay, I mean, they've become in a sense alienated from different contexts. And liberal societies, in fact, have not been able to give them anything meaningful to their lives. That's the point that I'm talking about. It's a kind of an emptying of life. So if you empty life, let's say, if you don't give a meaningful alternative, so what is it that liberal capitalism, in fact, is able to provide, to the younger generation? So what is it that they're offering? So if the conventional argument, in fact, is the meritocratic argument, okay, I mean, which is that liberal capitalism, in fact, is ultimately about creating a meritocratic order, then ultimately everything becomes what? Then ultimately everything becomes, hinged on the claims of merit. And liberals themselves, theoretically, liberal philosophers themselves, in fact, have been very, very critical of the claims of desert and merit. Okay, I mean, because of what? Because of the fact that, look, I mean, we don't choose our circumstances of birth, do we? Nobody is born poor by choice. So birth is a natural lottery. Okay, I mean, so you are either born rich or you're born poor. You have no control in this. So if I'm born rich, and as a result, my life chances, in fact, they are so much superior, let's say, to somebody who's born poor, do I necessarily have any ethical claim to these advantages in life? You get the point. Now, the liberal philosophers for a long period of time, in fact, they have been critical of this. Okay, I mean, they broadly make the argument that no, you cannot deserve these advantages because they're arbitrary from a moral point of view. In other words, you need compensation. But capitalism do not sufficiently compensate anymore. Okay, so what you find is that more and more people, in fact, they're orphaned. More and more people, in fact, they're deserted. And those who are orphaned and those who are deserted, they don't get the support of the people. They don't get the empathy of the people who succeed. So you get the point, I mean, so the justification is that, okay, I mean, everybody played by by the market. I succeeded because I'm good. You failed because you're not good enough. Now, once that culture, starts taking root, it empties empathy out of the system. You get the point. It completely desiccates the welter of solidarity in society. And when that happens, right-wing ideologies, in fact, would come and occupy these spaces. You get the point. It's not that the right wings, in fact, they're offering a kind of a panacea. It's not that. Okay. But what they're saying is that they're broadly making an argument that, look, we need to close doors. We need to find solidarity through exclusion. Because the alternative inclusive model of solidarity, in fact, had been given up by the liberals in the first place. So unless we are able to, whether it is the conventional liberals or socialists, whichever, I mean, sort of ideological positioning one might have, unless you are able to rediscover that inclusive solidarity in life, that empathy, you get the point, which doesn't judge people only by accidents of birth, by success and failure in the materiality of life. Right-wing tendencies, in fact, will have a field day. Right-wing tendencies would creep in. You get the point, because at one level they are efficacious because of their parochiality. When people are alienated, they become soft towards the parochial appeal. You get the point. Okay, I mean, so when you think that the state, in fact, is not doing enough, or we don't really get support, let's say, from people who have succeeded in life, then I tend to band with my own people, with my own tribe. I tend to feel that if that happens, maybe I would get some concrete benefits out of this, out of this. More importantly, I have an emotive sucker. Do you get the point? I have an emotive kind of, let's say, feeling happening there. Now, in the short run, people may not understand the dangers of these affiliations and identifications in life. You get the point? And they may not understand this because these ideas are actually, creating a function. Okay, they're serving a purpose, which the conventional, I would say dominant liberalism, in fact, was, had long forgotten. Okay, had long given up. And given the fact that they have given up, it doesn't really surprise that the alternative, in fact, is the right wing. You get the point? Because the left wing, if you look at it, the left wing, in fact, it has to come to terms with the great betrayals, let's say, okay, of the failures of the past. So it is not, in a sense, sort of measured up to it, and the increasing complexity of life. Okay, I mean, so it's impossible in the 20 in the, in the new millennium. It is impossible, in fact, to go back, let's say, to what, I mean, to the pristine Marxian, understanding of the fault lines of social life. You can't do that any longer, and you can't do that because of a variety of reasons. Okay, first, there is this problematization of the very, I would say, commitments of enlightenment itself. You get the point? I mean, to what extent modernity, for example, is a panacea to our problems. It could be that modernity is also responsible for many of our problems. Classical Marxism is a modernist paradigm. Do you get the point? Okay, the Marxists don't quarrel with the liberals so far as the, enormous, what could be called, productive capacity of capitalism, in fact, is concerned. Their battle, in fact, is on the idea that the Marxists, in fact, have always made the claim that the gains of capitalism, in fact, they're never equal because of the class nature of capitalism, because the gains get appropriated by the class. So if you don't have classes, then this abundance, in fact, becomes generalized abundance in human history for the first time. But the problem is resolved through the aegis of modernity, through science, through technology. Okay, but now there are these big question marks: environment, okay, and other factors, in fact, that have come up. So how is it that we are going to make sense through the old ontology that we have? Or you take the other point, which is the recognition of the fact that, look, we not only have legitimate grievances and problems on the axis of distribution, but we also have legitimate problems and grievances on the axis of status. And you can't collapse the axis of distribution to the axis of status. You can't do it either way. In simple terms, what I wanted to tell you is this: that, look, you can have, for example, let's say, a person of divine sexual orientation who is very rich. So a person of divine sexual orientation who is very rich, she doesn't suffer in the distributional, sense of the term. Her problem, in fact, is not economic. What is her problem? Her problem, in fact, is the insufficient recognition from society. Society doesn't recognize her deviation to be normal. You get the point? Now, in classical times, if you are looking at the classical ways in which the alternative was understood, these complexities, in fact, were less. But now the complexities have increased. And as the complexities have increased, the positioning of the critical, in fact, have become also far more difficult than at any point in time. And that also explains, in my opinion, why the right wing, in fact, finds the space, okay, which in fact was not available to it for a long period of time. And it now, therefore, in fact, has been able to occupy some of these places, which in fact has been vacated by the weakening and, I would say, the fragmentation of the older liberal model, the globalized liberal model, which in fact had been dominant for a long period.
Okay. The next one, please. This is from Adit Dashgupta. He asks, given this pandemic situation, every now and then we hear that this pandemic will kind of alter the international order and affect the international interrelations among important states and democracies. What are your opinions on the particular issue? What is going to be the face of international order during this new normal grand narrative? That's the same question I had too.
Oh, right. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I mean, my position is very categorical here, which is that I don't see that the pandemic will make any changes to the dynamic of the international order at all. Okay, because the order is set long term. Okay, the pandemic is a shock, undoubtedly, and sometimes systemic shocks can lead to, I would say, major transformation. But I mean, there is enough epidemiological findings by now, which sort of says that look, by uh, maybe by the middle of next year, this pandemic, in fact, is going to be contained one way or the other. Okay, now the impact of the pandemic is felt, no doubt about it. But if you look closely and if you ask yourself that what do we witness in terms of the effect, what do we witness in terms of the impact? One is that obviously there's an enormous economic cost to it. Okay, I mean, so there's a unprecedented economic decline. Hmm. Now, the economic decline, in fact, might lead to various kinds of responses again. Okay, I mean, it might either lead to protectionism, more protectionism, where states, in fact, become more and more, inclusive inwardly, or it might actually, sort of at a certain point of time, encourage more robust multilateralism. So both possibilities, in fact, are there. Okay. Or the second that comes to my mind is nationalism. Do you get the point? Now, the pandemic, in fact, had erupted at a time when nationalism was already strong. Okay, I mean, it didn't really happen when nationalism was weak. So it might therefore obviously further strengthen nationalism all over the world. Okay, I mean, so as you saw, but on the other hand, there is also the possibility that states, in fact, might realize that when they are confronted with problems whose nature, in fact, cannot be limited to the territorial mapping of the world, they need to come up with more, innovative solutions. Let's say, okay, they need to cooperate. Okay, I mean, so if they are unable to cooperate, then they would not be able to fight a problem of this nature. Do you get the point? But again, there is nothing definitive that you can say that what kind of an impact the pandemic, in fact, would have on the system in terms of a value like nationalism. Because the fundamental point is that nationalism, in fact, is a preset value. Okay, I mean, the pandemic didn't bring this value, or the pandemic, in fact, is not going to end this value. Okay, do you get the point? It's going to have some, in a sense, this is something which is going to impact on nationalism. But what is the nature of national impact that you have, that one would have to see. I mean, like, for example, if you look at nationalistic politics, for example, now nationalistic politics demand certain things. Okay, like, for example, it would demand securitizing demographic. So what is this securitizing demographic means? It means that some people, in fact, would have to be all the time separated from others. Okay, I mean, so you have to identify enemies. You have to name them. Do you get the point? I mean, you have to brand them. You have to call them enemies. Now, this again is a trend which predates the pandemic. You get the point? So if you look at some of the debates that we were having in India, for example, okay, which were very, 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 very polarizing debates. Now, those polarizing debates, in fact, were happening before the pandemic. They're not the results of the pandemic. Would the pandemic end those debates? The pandemics are not going to end those debates. Do you get the point? I mean, you can't really have the kind of mobilization that you would, that one had prior to the pandemic for obvious biological health reasons. Do you get the point? But the fact is what? But the fact is that, look, the brand of exceptional securitized politics, in fact, had already been there, had already, in fact, become more powerful. And the pandemic, in a sense, accentuates this because it becomes obviously now easier for the government to shut people to their homes. It becomes easier for people, in fact, to say that don't come out and cogitate, don't mobilize because it's not good in the interest of the nation, not good in the interest of your own health. Do you get the point? But this is sort of fundamental transformation. So in a sense, I mean, I don't agree to the Agambanian, formulation, for example, that, I mean, you can explain all that you were witnessing in terms of physical distancing and everything as extensions of biopolitics, which is normalizing, the politics of life and death. I don't agree to it. I mean, there's enough health evidence, in fact, to suggest that the only way that we can fight the pandemic, in fact, is by strictly following the uh, the regulations, in fact, which the doctors and uh, the healthcare professionals, in fact, they're providing and they're saying. But the fact is what? The fact is that, look, you can't say that medicine, in fact, operates in a world which is independent of politics. Can you? There's no world which is independent of politics. Okay, so the context, in fact, will matter. But what I'm drawing your attention to is that, look, I mean, as students of society, whether you are looking at it backward historically or you are trying to make sense of it in contemporaneous terms, it's only possible to have a certain sense of possibilities. You can't never really be very definitive about what is going to happen. You get the point. And the pandemic, in fact, keeps both these opposed tendencies open. So, in a sense, the pandemic, in fact, is like everything else in life, is a kind of a living dialectic. Okay, I mean, so it keeps open both the possibilities. How the dialectic, in fact, will ultimately play itself, well, we'll have to wait and see. And it's not going to, it's not going to manifest uniformly across the world. Different parts of the world, in fact, will see different kinds of trends unfolding, because there's no one history, okay, to mankind. There's no one, let's say, sort of face to the global, let's say, sort of history, or to global contemporary, to the global system, contemporary global system. So the pandemic is a shock. It's a endogenous, exogenous, both way. It's a major shock, but it's not really going to fundamentally, I think, destroy the underpinnings of the system. Let's say, my whole argument today was that, look, the system that we are living, the legs of the system, in fact, they are wobbly legs. Okay, I mean, they have become weak for a considerable period of time. The liberal order, in fact, is trying to, in a sense, again get back to shape, but the challenges are so huge that it might seem impossible, in fact, to get back to the shape, at least in the short period of time, because the accent now, in fact, is anti-globalization kind of an accent. Okay, I mean, so it's more protectionism, it's more closing of borders rather than opening borders, it's giving more attention to your own folk. You get the point. Okay, I mean, more a kind of a separatist sort of discourse. But how long that is sustainable, given the long-term secular material transformations that the world, in fact, have witnessed, that the world, in fact, has witnessed, now that's something which only time will tell. Okay, I mean, so crystal ball gazing, in fact, is something which is very difficult in social sciences. We can possibly say something about the broad patterns and trends. Leave it there.
All right. Okay. The next one. Paromita Banerjee. I think this is the same question. How will this pandemic reshape? Yeah, you have already answered this one.
I mean,
The next
it's
question, please.
difficult to say very
Yeah.
categorically what will happen.
Okay. So moving on to the next question, sir. Okay. Um, Tina Bhattacharjee, she asks, we can see that China is dominating internationally. Okay, I think we have to, like, don't understand the question very well. I think she means that uh, India's relationship with China, how will that affect the international system, um, especially when China's power is kind of more?
Yeah,
I think that's what she
yeah, yeah,
tries to say.
yeah. I got it. Well, I mean,
Okay.
this is, I think, this has to be looked the other way around. Okay, I mean, which is that, what is the change in the nature of the international system? That one has to understand very clearly. If you understand the nature of change in the international system, how the international system, in fact, is changing, then it will become partly, I think, clear to you that which powers, in fact, are becoming more powerful and which powers, in fact, are becoming less powerful. Okay, I mean, so again, look, the rise of China is not a new thing. The pandemic didn't lead to the rise of China. The pandemic is a critical moment to that rise, no doubt about it. To get the point, but is it really a great advantage, let's say, to the rise of China. No, there is a huge literature which sort of questions this and says that, look, the Chinese, in fact, they thought that they might be able to use the pandemic, let's say, to their advantage. But such, in fact, had been the disruptions in the supply chain linkages throughout the world that many of their, plans like the Belt and Road Initiative and other, grand, I would say, capitalization plans which the Chinese, in fact, have. Many of them, in fact, have really taken a serious hit. Okay, I mean, because you have to understand something. Like the other capitalist powers, the Chinese also need to bring the capital out of their own country and invest it profitably outside. Now, the problem is that the pandemic, in fact, has hit so badly most of the countries that where is the opportunity for the Chinese either to make investment? Where is the opportunity for the Chinese to sell their wares? You get the point, okay? I mean, so it's a major problem. Now, the contestation between India and China is a separate issue altogether. It's a historical problem. It's a post-colonial problem. It's mired in complexities of various kinds. Now, the fact is what? The fact is that in the given situation, let me offer a structural, answer to the question, which is that, look, both India and China, in fact, have become major powers. Okay, there could be differential in the levels of the, of the power of the two states, but both are major powers. Now, when both become major powers, which means the difference in the quantum of power between India and China, in fact, has come down. It has declined. As the difference in the quantum of power between the United States and China, in fact, has also come down. So the fact is what? So the fact is that when that happens, when power actually decreases, the tensions will automatically increase. You get the point of why the tension will increase, I'll tell you, is because that the whole debate is, let me tell you, the whole debate is that whether the Chinese would be happy to continue with the present architecture or the Chinese want to refurbish the existing architecture. That is where the debate, in fact, is. Now, if the Chinese, they would decide to play by the rules of the existing architecture, then one doesn't really, then one would not witness major cataclysmic wars and major cataclysmic sort of changes. But if the Chinese want to change the rules of the game, then one doesn't know what's going to happen. You get the point. And the reason why you find these tensions happening, whether it is in Ladakh, whether it is in the, in Arunachal, in other places also, is because of the fact that both in different ways, the nationalist leadership in China and the statist leadership in India, both, in fact, they find in foreign policy a convenient escape route to their domestic problems. Okay, I mean, so if uh, if border tensions increase, it means what it means, that people, in fact, become automatically more nationalistic. Okay, and there is a certain legitimacy to that nationalism also, because then you say that it's your patriotic duty. Okay, you need to pay attention to what the Chinese, in fact, are doing to our borders. Similarly, the average Chinese, in fact, are told that the Indians, in fact, they are making incursions, so they are taking away territory which belongs to China. So look, these are domestic legitimation games, and when we get locked into these domestic legitimation games, the temperature rises.
The next one. Do we have any other questions? Just let me check once. I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. Okay. I
Thank
can
you so
see,
much.
I don't see any other question. Yeah, so thank you, sir,
Thank you so
for
much. Thank you so
explaining
much.
things so lucidly. And a big thank you from Team Voyages into the Past for giving us some time out of your busy schedule. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We hope to hear more from you in future. Stay safe. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, and a big thank you to our audience. Um, okay, so, okay, now let me announce something that we have our next live lecture. It is scheduled to be held on 11th September, that is this Friday, from 5 p.m. onwards by Dr. Parul Pandadhar, and she will be talking on the topic Art in Translation, Icons and Narratives Across the Indian Ocean. So keep following our Facebook page and our YouTube channel and stay updated. Have a good night. Thank you.